Good afternoon, and thanks for showing up on a Friday afternoon, a nice Friday afternoon, conducive to good attendance as well as the possibilities and definite possibilities of hearing a good talk. My name is John Bodner. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Institute for Advanced Study. We're sponsoring Professor Culler's visit this week to Bloomington as part of our Branigin lecture series. Branigin lecture series is the result of an endowment that the Institute has had for a number of years that allows us to bring distinguished scholars to campus, and we've been able to bring a number of distinguished and interesting individuals to Bloomington this year. One of the things I like about the Branigin series that the IAS sponsors is that people like Professor Culler sort of reverberate throughout the campus when they're here. They don't come and just give a talk, but they meet with undergraduates and they meet with graduate students and they participate, as he did yesterday, in a panel on the future of the humanities, and we sort of maximize and extract all we can from these distinguished people and keep them quite busy over the course of their visit. The Institute for Advanced Study also sponsors programs of visiting fellowships that bring scholars to campus to collaborate with IU faculty, and a series of interdisciplinary seminars and workshops, including the ongoing empathy workshop, which has just secured funding for several more years from external sources. I'd like to now call upon Professor Peretz to provide the introduction to Professor Culler this afternoon. Professor Peretz.
I'm very pleased to welcome Johnathan Culler. Professor Culler, who is the class of 1916 professor of English and Comparative Literature at Cornell University, is a particularly fitting presence to help us celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Department of Comparative Literature, where he has been at the forefront of our discipline for the last 35 years. In a series of by now classic texts, such as Flaubert and the Uses of Uncertainty, Structuralist Poetics, The Pursuit of Science, On Deconstruction, Literary Theory, A Very Short Introduction, and others, Johnathan Culler has proven to be one of the major actors in, as well as perhaps the most influential and widely read cartographer of, an especially intense, controversial, and rich era in the history of the strange activity known as literary criticism. This era, whose beginning, at least on the American scene, is often traced to a legendary conference on critical languages and the sciences of men, held in 1966 at the Johns Hopkins University, and whose end is what is very much still in question. Is it still going on? Did it end already a long time ago? This era stands under the sign of theory. That is, under the sign of some kind of pressure to formulate its activity in generalizable or even universalizable terms. The study of the literary needs to be theoretical, this era seems to sense. Yet what precisely does this mean? What kind of generalizability or universalizability are we talking about here? What is the pressure of the theoretical that seemed at a certain moment to loom over literary studies? Is this pressure of a very specific kind, a kind that uniquely belongs to the literary, or does it signify something much wider than the literary, some kind of general field in which literary studies, among other fields, no more or less is implicated? In the modern era, we seem to be familiar with mainly two types of demands to formulate things generally or universally. The first is that of philosophy, the second that of science. In the most general way, we can say that the scientific enterprise involves the formulation of generalizable rules for a particular field or territory of reality, as biology, for example, for the domain of life. While philosophy is not interested in this or that particular domain or section of reality, but in the general way in which anything whatsoever can be said to belong to a meaningful world. Or, in the candid formulation, it is interested in the conditions necessary for something to be an object of experience. If these options, the philosophical and the scientific one, are indeed the two modalities in which the demand for generalizability comes, it would seem that if literature comes under the sway of this demand, it would either take the form of science and become a science and demand the science of literature, in which case literature would be understood as a specific field or territory, or would somehow be viewed as participating in the philosophical project, and would then be seen either as a philosophical type of activity, investigating the general conditions of meaning, or alternatively belonging to a specific philosophical branch, such as aesthetics, which investigates the general logic of beauty in its relation to the question of the general conditions of meaning. However, what the demands for universal visibility on the part of literature required was, it appears, neither of these options, but rather some third kind of demand, which belongs neither exactly to the scientific logic of territory, nor to the philosophical logic of the conditions of meaning, but is somehow in between them. And this third kind is, I suggest, what has come to require the strange name of theory, a name that has mainly been inflected in two ways, either in relation to the literary, such as in literary theory, or under the general vague name theory standing on its own. It is the strangeness of the third kind, theory, the attempt to come to terms with a thinking that is neither exactly philosophical nor scientific, and in which the question of the literary plays a privileged role that has from early on guided Johnathan Culler's efforts. How can one articulate that which does not exactly have a specific domain or territory of its own, nor is purely general or universal, and why is it literature that is particularly essential for such an enterprise? This, I suggest, is an implicit question Culler seems to struggle with, and perhaps most intensely in a recent collection of essays with a remarkable title, The Literary in Theory. The richness and complexity of this title requires a lengthy reading, but I would simply point here to a double relation between the question of the literary and the question of theory that it raises. Theory, the title seems to suggest, is a way of thinking which encompasses the realm of the literary, but is wider than it, extending presumably to non-literary realms. On the other hand, theory itself, whatever it might be, is designated as being literary, as having as its essential determination something that is of a literary nature. To think theory and to think the literary are thus essentially intertwined, Culler suggests, but in such a way that it is perhaps that which we call literary that allows theory to consist of a unique and new type of generality or universality, to be something that extends in a way to all realms and not only to literature. This might only be possible if we understand the literary itself as no longer designating a specific realm or territory, but as something that both belongs and does not belong to all territories, something that interrupts every territory from within, marking its limit and exposing it to an outside, to other realms, opening ways of passage in between them. Thus, if theory is literary, it must be the thinking that investigates all realms at their limits, or investigates those places where each realm is itself yet no longer itself. According to this logic, theory, unlike philosophy, will be implicated with specific realms in a very detailed manner, trying to grasp their singularity. But unlike science, it will not be limited to any specific realm, for it will be interested in the limit where each realm is exposed to an outside and to other realms. We might say that whereas philosophy is interested in the very idea of having a realm, but in no realm specifically, and science is interested in what is inside a specific realm, theory will be interested in the limits of realms, in the passages between them. Where science always needs to come in the plural, as biology, zoology, physics, depending on the realm of its application, theory, like philosophy, comes in the singular, belonging to no specific domain. Theory will thus be everywhere, but also nowhere. Indeed, what seems to fascinate Culler most of all, what he struggles to comprehend in this collection of essays, are all these phenomena that seems to belong everywhere, but also nowhere, having no specific domain of their own, but only consisting in passageways between various domains. In addition to the coupled domains of theory and the literary, two additional terms, designated academic fields, cultural studies and comparative literature, particularly engage Culler's attention, insofar as they seem to have no specific territory. Perhaps it is his attraction to these areas, whose logic is that of being everywhere and nowhere, that leads him to elaborate the paradoxical notion of a triumph which must be particularly meaningful to all comparatives today. A triumph that is finally a loss. Theory in general, and the field of comparative literature in particular, says Culler, have triumphed in that their influence is now felt everywhere. No field is now exempt from the power of the literary and the theoretical, the triumph that institutionally Culler associates with the field of comparative literature. Yet this triumph comes at a heavy price, for having infiltrated everywhere, these fields or discourses have no realm or room of their own left, thus no precise identity of their own, for a triumph is usually understood to be the triumph of an appropriation by an identity of a territory that it now can call its own. That this specific triumph, Culler is naming, consists of a loss of territory, thus of a dispossession. What is the nature of this triumphant dispossession? Can it be said to have a future, or does it imply a total disappearance? I trust that Professor Culler's following remarks will shed some light on these questions.
So my pleasure in being here to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the founding of comparative literature is qualified by sadness. Sadness that Henry, I'm going to move it down a little bit. Sadness that Henry Wellek, one of the founders of the program and an old friend, is not here to celebrate it with us. Henry, as you know, who, as you know better than I do, who served both the program and the university with great devotion, even into his retirement years, died about a year ago at age 92, I think, so just missing the celebration of this longevity of the program that he founded with Horst Frenz and doubtless others, at a time when comparative literature was really just beginning on this continent. I believe I first met Henry in the 1970s, and I think we served together on the Bureau of the International Comparative Literature Association, and so met in various exotic places. But I most clearly remember a week or so with him in Hungary in some project sponsored by the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. He was really a wonderfully engaging man, with very broad literary and artistic interests, and an amazing human touch. At the time, I was a young Turk championing structuralism and such things, movements with which Henry had very little sympathy, but he loved to tease me about my enthusiasms, and long after I had left youth behind and entered middle age, he would continue to treat me as a young Turk and young whippersnapper, and making me feel young, he says, young again, as of course he himself remained serving the university in various capacities and the cause of comparative literature long into retirement. So as you know, Indiana was one of the early centers for comparative literature, a discipline founded in this country mostly by European emigres who arrived shortly before or after the Second World War, bringing their cosmopolitan perspective, their multilingual cultural competencies, and above all, I think their hope for a broad humanistic study of literatures and cultures would bring understanding and bring the advancement of civil society that had brutally been cut off by the rise of Nazism in Europe. That sense of comparative literature as above all multilingual and cosmopolitan reigned in the early years when the discipline was not defined theoretically, and where the nearest thing to a model for comparative literary study was cross-cultural source study, or study of cross-cultural influence. Indiana, as it happened, or not as it happened, Indiana, naturally, should I say, was the source of a large number of early and influential books on the nature and method of comparative literature. Most important was Horst Frenz and Newton Stalnack's Comparative Literature, Method and Perspectives of 1961, with essays by many Indiana professors. And then later on, Ulrich Weisstein's Einführung in der vergleichende Literaturwissenschaft, followed by what I take it to be an English translation, though a different title, Comparative Literature and Literary Theory, a Survey and Introduction of 1970-74. But the Frenz and Stalnack volume began with a piece by Henry Wellek, Comparative Literature, Its Definition and Function, which a piece that was widely cited and that is sometimes credited with inaugurating the idea that comparative literature is not restricted to literature only, So as Rimac put it at the beginning of his article, comparative literature is the study of literature beyond the confines of one particular country, and the study of the relationships between literature on the one hand and other areas of knowledge and belief, such as the arts, e.g. painting, sculpture, architecture, music, philosophy, history, the social sciences, e.g. politics, economics, sociology, the sciences, religion, etc., on the other. In brief, it is the comparison of one literature with another or others, and the comparison of literature with other spheres of human expression, and a very broad conception of comparative literature. He says that he thinks few comparatists would disagree with this, and of course that was completely wrong, that many comparatists disagreed with that sense that the entire world of culture, including science, was the purview of comparative literature. But that was a rather prescient notion of what comparative literature might become, for better or for worse. Henry was extraordinarily widely read and cultivated man. He was not interested in theory, shall we say, and skeptical even about analysis, I would say. He once wrote, "Professors are paid to find meaning in phenomena that may have no meaning." And he once complained about his colleagues that, and again in print, a professor of literature can be defined as someone unlikely to discuss literature in his spare time. So, but with his broad cultural interests, he welcomed the breadth of concerns that have become typical of comparative literature, though I believe he would feel that the discipline has strayed too far in that direction, because he was always inclined to put the study of literature at the center of comparative literature, whatever other arts or forms of knowledge and belief were brought into comparison. He wrote, as in the passage I just quoted, that the comparison of literature with other spheres of human expression. So you always had to have literature in there somewhere. And certainly for Henry, the notion of comparative literature as home of theory never appealed to him, though it seems to me eminently logical. Since comparative literature cannot avoid the question, as national literature departments can, of what sorts of units are most pertinent for academic analysis or study, whether it's genre, is it period, is it themes, is it authors, how do you organize the study of literature once you're doing comparative literature? Since it has to consider also the nature of literature, literariness, if it's going to think about how to approach literature in relation to all these other spheres of knowledge. Since it cannot avoid these questions and simply sort of follow a national literature in its historical evolution, comparative literature developed quite early on habits of self-reflexivity, which that can be at odds with that tradition of cosmopolitan literary comparison that was at work in its foundation in this country. So comparative literature often became, in the 1970s and 80s in particular, the site of theory in general, and the site for engagement with a variety of critical discourses, different kinds, as Eyal has just mentioned, that came to be assimilated to the field of comparative literature under the name of theory. We don't say theory of what, just theory for short, as it were. While national literature departments in those days frequently resisted, or at least remained indifferent to the sorts of theory that did not emanate from their own national domain. The comparative literature came thus to be distinguished by its interest in addressing theoretical issues as well as knowledgeably importing and exploring sort of various foreign theoretical discourses, including those of continental philosophy, which philosophy departments were often neglecting. So comparative literature was where questions begged in the national literature departments were taken up, argued about, even made the focus of teaching and research. So concretely, comparative literature was where you would likely to find a course on Foucault or Derrida or Benjamin, or where you could read Hegel, Adorno, Baudrillard, etc. Now that is no longer exclusively the case, as Eyal mentioned. Nowadays you can find courses on Foucault everywhere, it seems. If Complit is no longer the home of theory, it's because, as Eyal mentioned, so many people in so many other departments are dealing with, they've dealing with theoretical texts. So many have come around, shall we say, to the view of comparatists. And even the study of American literature, which for so long was committed to exceptionalism and totalization. To be an Americanist, you had to have a theory about the distinctiveness of America and American experience. Even American literature now seems to be organizing itself increasingly as sort of comparative American literatures. A striking development, which I wouldn't have predicted myself, certainly. So the concerns once typical of comparative literature have become everybody's concerns, or as Hans Sossi puts it in the latest report, every 10 years there's a report for the American Comparative Literature Association about the state of the field. In the latest, Hans Sossi speaks of comparatists we have become universal donors, as he says. What we have can fit everybody's field. None of them have blood types that are really different from ours, or they reject us. But of course, comparative literature departments have not reaped the benefit of this, and they remain small, except at Indiana, where you have a very large department with its own lines, etc., that the dean has not tried to take away. I guess very, very good. And departments elsewhere are often threatened in times of austerity. The comparative literature might seem something that you could do without, since you have all these things going on in other departments as well. Hans Sossi, in this article mentioned, fantasizes that people in other national literature, in other departments, ought to have to pay a small tax to comparative literature each time they cite Gayatri Spivak or Eric Auerbach or Paul de Man or Edward Said, etc. But which would do wonders for the field if we could make a little collection. So, well, I have argued first in my response to the, not the Sossi report, but the previous report, the Charlie Bernheimer's report on comparative literature in the age of multiculturalism, I think, that was the name of that one. I argued that as national literature departments have increasingly allowed literary and cultural studies to reorganize, have increasingly allowed literary and cultural studies to organize themselves around questions that emerge from theoretical debates rather than conventional literary historical periods. And as these departments have increasingly brought a wider range of cultural phenomena into their purview, not just film and popular culture, but discourses of sexuality, the construction of the body, formation of national and cultural identities, etc. They have become, in effect, departments of national cultural studies. I mean, English and American studies, French studies, German studies, etc. The turn to culture makes a lot of sense for national literature departments. I mean, the division of literature by national or linguistic boundaries was always rather dubious, but such divisions are a very reasonable way of attempting to organize the study of culture. So perhaps as German literature departments turn to German cultural studies and French literature departments to French cultural studies, the national names will finally come to represent fields that are more intellectually coherent. And as the national departments turn to culture, they leave comparative literature with a potential subject or a potential identity at last, a distinctive role, as comparative literature might find itself with the new identity as precisely the site for literary studies in its broadest dimensions, as other departments sort of abandon that or make that no longer definitional for them. The study of literature as a transnational phenomenon, which of course it is. So the devolution of other fields would have left comparative literature with a distinctive and valuable identity at last. And comparative literature, as site for the study of literature in general, would provide a logical home for poetics. So, for instance, the study of genres has been out of fashion for some time. Fred Jameson wrote, I think in The Political Unconscious, so many years ago, that genre criticism has, and I quote, been thoroughly discredited by modern literary theory and practice. But I think that the two things that have been discredited are, first, the notion of a genre as a set of rules that have to be followed, and then second, the idea that the purpose of generic categories is to tell us is to classify works and to tell us whether a certain thing, something is a novel or an anti-novel, for example. So I would argue that it's at the level of genres, the rise and fall of genres, the modulation of a genre, that literature has a history, and that this history is clearly comparative. Whatever period of Western literature we examine, whether it's the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, Enlightenment, modernism, etc., post-romanticism, postmodernism, literature is clearly a transnational phenomenon. And I think it's at the level of genres and their transformations that it's most perspicuously studied. Now, I know that comp-lit departments are not going to give up cultural studies, and certainly nobody has hastened to rally to this proposal of mine that let the national literature departments do cultural studies and we will finally do literature ourselves. There are signs, I think, that signs at least that the notion of a revival in the interest of genre, for instance, in 2007, PMLA devoted a special issue to remapping genre, and the subject of last fall's, last September's meeting of the English Institute was entitled simply genre. And the so-called, in the domain that particularly interests me, the so-called new lyric studies has sparked a lively debate about the validity and bearing of the notion of lyric as a genre. In the afterword to the 2007 issue of PMLA called Remapping Genres, Bruce Robbins compares the notion of genres to norms in the socioeconomic realm that allow, for example, transnational comparison of living standards. And he argues that the case for genre in a nutshell is that of historical comparison. Genre, he writes, is a crucial instrument for combating the professional inclination to focus on a literary period, which he calls a sort of pseudo-anthropocentric norm that has been adopted for a long time out of laziness. It's one level of magnification among others, no less valid than any other, but also no less arbitrary, the notion of a literary period. Genre, he insists, offers us versions of history that take us beyond the period-by-period agenda of our ordinary studies. And why, he asks in conclusion, would criticism voluntarily deprive itself of the additional scale of trans-periodic vision and aggregations that the notion of genre brings into view? Why indeed? And such aggregating, I would stress, such aggregating and re-aggregating is the particular province of comparative literature. But rather than continue in that sort of vein, where a familiar one, where one outlines a future in the hopes that this might actually help that happen, help to bring about the future that one favors. And so instead of, let me shift modes, and instead of prediction, prediction designed to pave the way for what I favor, let me offer some ideas about comparative literature and the future of theory by undertaking some empirical reporting, which is not my usual thing, I should add, empirical reporting. I'm chairing the jury for the Rene Wellek Prize, which is awarded biennially by the American Comparative Literature Association for the best book in literary theory. And my committee received 77 books published during the past 2 years, which publishers thought were sufficiently theoretical to have a chance at winning a theory prize. When you add to that some others that have come to my attention in other ways, though I should stress I haven't been looking out for more theory books this past year. There are enough there on the shelf at the moment. But if you add those others that have come to my attention, there's quite a substantial corpus, though some of these entries, I would stress, aren't actually very relevant to the future of theory. Publishers have to send a copy to each member of the jury, 3 members of the jury, plus 1 to the ACLA Secretariat, and that's supposed to be a bar that's supposed to discourage frivolous entries. But some publishers, Yale University Press, for example, with some publishers, I wonder if they didn't think of this as a way of just getting rid of a stock of unsold books that they had sitting in their warehouse. At any rate, Yale must have sent us, 8 or 10 books, none of which seemed remotely theoretical, as far as I could tell. At any rate, surveying this group, one can hazard an account of the directions of theory today, though when you do, I'm sort of caught between, the most obvious thing to do is simply to list and describe the most interesting books. But once I go beyond that to generalizations, they become very dubious. But obviously, I don't want to just list books, so I will generalize. But you bear in mind that these are dubious generalizations. But I would say first, and not a dubious generalization, I think that this field seemed considerably stronger than the field 2 years ago when I was also on this jury. Then we had a small number of very good books. The winner was Joey Slaughter's Human Rights Incorporated, the World Novel, Narrative Form, and International Law. There was a handout up at the entrance which lists all these titles I'm going to mention, so you don't have to scurry to write them down. But that was the book we 2 years ago chose as the winner, and we wrote about it at a time when human rights has become an important focus of interest in literary and cultural studies. Joseph Slaughter's I'll skip some of the laudatory adjectives here, but explores what he argues as the crucial role of the novel, and particularly the European Bildungsroman, in creating the subject of human rights, the subject of whom rights can be predicated. Reading European novels, but especially their post-colonial successors, Slaughter shows how they have done crucial sociocultural work in the absence of international structures that might articulate and enforce human rights. They've done this work by naturalizing, rendering natural the subject of rights, and rendering intelligible a concept of the individual to whom human rights law can then apply. So he argues that the Bildungsroman can be read as the cultural correlative of human rights, and that human rights are globalized in our time by the widespread translation of the humanism that these novels share, as well as by our consumer-driven commodity economy. So this is a very theoretically sophisticated and historically informed book that examines, among other things, complicity of human rights law and the novel with globalization and multinational capitalism. And then the close runner-up 2 years ago was Natalie Melas's All the Difference in the World, Post-Coloniality and the Ends of Comparison, which reflects, it's a book explicitly about comparative literature that reflects on the nature of comparison in the discipline of comparative literature, especially once you move outside the European orbit where there might have been taken to be standards of comparison by which you can, and how is comparison made possible within a broader globalized universe. So it calls for and also exemplifies a process of an examination of the process of comparison itself in the context of newly globalized comparative literary and cultural study. So those were two outstanding books, but 2 years ago, after the top half a dozen books, there seemed to us a significant falling off, whereas this year all the members of the jury agreed that there were at least a dozen books to which we would happily award the prize, or which we would happily award the prize. It's also striking that last time around that both the winners were deeply engaged with post-colonial studies, which seemed a particularly vital branch of literary and cultural theory. This time, whether by chance or not, although there are probably a dozen books that were concerned with empires and their aftermaths and ways of representing the exotic other, etc., several of which are quite impressive accomplishments. But the collection of books did not make one feel that the post-colonial was the most vital area of literary studies. I put on the list a couple of books that we like, which include Christopher Miller's The French Atlantic Triangle. It's a major work of theoretically informed literary history that explores the implications of the figure of slavery in literature and in culture, especially in the French Francophone orbit. And then an interesting book, Eric Heyo's Hypothetical Mandarin, Sympathy, Modernity, and Chinese Pain, which elaborates the ubiquitous figure of the suffering Chinese. I don't know whether, when I was young, people would say, eat your food, think of the starving millions in China. That was the sort of cliche, right? The idea of and so he is interested in that figure, in examples that raise questions about standards of moral judgment in relation to otherness, the extent of sympathy and the status of the suffering of people from other cultures, especially far removed cultures. And then especially, I think the last book of that category is Michael Rothsberg's Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, which really rather boldly seeks to read Holocaust studies in the context of thinking about post-coloniality. But interestingly, none of these three books are orthodox works of post-colonial theory or criticism of the sort that we've become accustomed to, which may suggest that post-coloniality has become a space within which all sorts of different kinds of projects may now be attempted, that there is not an orthodoxy here after all. So, but the question of how to report on what we learned about comparative literature and the directions of theory from this exercise. if I start with, I can start with one end of a continuum, shall we say, with books, the books about theorists. That's one, so you can think of that as one end. Books which do theory by explicating the work of particular theorists or take off from the work of particular theorists. So clearly the explication of major theorists is still an important enterprise in this realm. First we have Leland de la Durantaye's Giorgio Agamben, which is a very large and systematic survey of Agamben's work, pulling together many disparate threads, especially in the political, socio-political thought, both a sign of Agamben's standing at the moment in the realm of comparative literary studies and theory, and a very, very valuable contribution. My one regret with this book is that he did not try to deal with, and it's, with Agamben's, and it sort of helps to. I mean, it's too bad, especially in the context of a prize for comparative literature, that he did not try to deal with Agamben's scattered reflections on literature, which have been subject to very little attention. And it seems as though every month there's a new article about Agamben and biopower or bare life or something, but about Agamben and politics or Agamben and the human, and etc. But nothing about his various discussions of the troubadours, of Italian vernacular poetry, of strains of modern Italian verse, and their relation to his reflection on language have been so far quite widely neglected. So there is a project there if anyone is on the lookout for a useful theoretical project, Agamben on literature. The second remarkable book is Martin Hagelin's Radical Atheism, Derrida and the Time of Life. Martin is a student of mine, so he can't win the prize, alas. But and I probably should not dwell on it, but it is an extraordinary book that reassesses the entire trajectory of Derrida's work, arguing primarily the argument is against recent claims that Derrida's work has been marked by an ethical or especially a religious turn, and showing that from the outset, Derrida's concern with temporality goes along with a valuing of survival, of the mortal, the temporal, and a rejection of the desire for immortality and transcendence that structures so much thought. The notion of survival that Derrida develops is living on, etc. Survival is quite incompatible with immortality, since it defines life as essentially mortal, as inherently divided by time. So that radical finitude of survival is not some lack that needs to be a lack of being that it's desirable to overcome, as so many theories have presumed, but rather the finitude of survival creates the possibility of everything that is desired and the threat of everything that's feared. So in pursuing that theme, Martin Hagelin explores Derrida's relation to the thought of Kant, Husserl, Levinas, and Laclos, as well as to current debates about democracy and ethics and the return of religion, sort of in the orbit of Derridean thought. And he takes on the most eminent interpreters of Derrida in quite effective argument, I think. But it's a book that doesn't deal directly with literature, but much less comparative literature. But given the centrality of the thinking of time in literature, it's a book that I think will find a very productive place within comparative literature and offer an open, fruitful directions for theory. Another major book on Derrida is Hillis Miller's For Derrida, a collection of very clear, very pedagogical essays about various aspects of Derrida's work, mostly essays written since Derrida's death. And so they're essays that make evident the vast range of subjects on which Derrida had something significant to say, and give us valuable accounts of Derrida's speculation on his special theory of performativity, or his writing about mourning, about decision, writing about touch, etc., a host of things. There are no books on Alain Badiou in this crop, which made me happy, I suppose. Happy not to have to read books about Badiou. But two important books will be out very soon. Bruno Bastille's Badiou and Politics is forthcoming from Duke. It's just shorter versions of that book have already been published in French and Spanish. And there's also a very interesting book forthcoming from Edinburgh by Jean-Jacques Le Cerf, the Marxist critic, French Marxist critic and theorist of language, called Badiou and Deleuze Read Literature, saying Badiou and Deleuze are the two geniuses of our time, and here's why, which is very effective and interesting for comparatists in that its approach to their work is through what they have to say about literature, through their engagements with literature. That's not on our plate, unfortunately, at the moment. But Walter Benjamin, who's standing in the world of theory and comparative literature, is still extraordinarily high, I think is the object of another very interesting book by Sam Weber's Benjamin's Abilities, with a dash before abilities. It's ability in the sense of Barkeit. This book focuses on Benjamin's interest in concepts created with the suffix ability, as in translatability, so Barkeit, reproducibility, things of that sort. And thus Benjamin's thinking about possibility or potentiality, as it were, in the context of the European philosophical tradition from Kant to Derrida. It's a book. It also includes some miscellaneous essays on other topics, but about Benjamin. But mostly it's that focus, very close focus on some Benjaminian concepts. And there are several other works of theory focus on a tradition rather than a particular theorist. Most notably, Ray Terada's Looking Away: Phenomenality and Dissatisfaction from Kant to Adorno. I like the dissatisfaction in that title. It resonates nicely. This is a successor to Terada's important book, earlier book, Feeling in Theory, which was a pioneering study of affect in post-structuralist theory. So this book undertakes very subtle readings of philosophical texts by Kant, Coleridge, Nietzsche, and Adorno, and explores what she calls our right to desire something other than experience as it appears to be. And she sees this as an alternative to aesthetics. It's attention to peripheral phenomena, attention to peripheral phenomena in the face of normative pressure to accept facts, to accept a stable world of appearances and a given world. So she writes, after Kant, one needs particularly ephemeral perceptual experiences, perceptions that seem below or marginal to normal appearances, to figure the possibility of fleeting relief from the pressure to endorse what Kant calls the world as is. So with her interest in sort of offbeat perceptions and ephemera, spectral effects, she suggests a relationship. She goes on to suggest a relationship between the question of ephemeral experiences and the turn to queer theory in literary and cultural studies, which interestingly was not very much manifest in these books that we received this year, the queer theory. Taking a breather for a moment, I think, perhaps. So in addition to works of theory in a philosophical vein, we had a couple of works of psychoanalysis that I've put on the list: Esther Rashkin's Unspeakable Secrets and Psychoanalysis of Culture, and Ruth Lee's From Guilt to Shame, Auschwitz and After. But certainly psychoanalysis seems a much less central or animating force in literary and cultural theory now than it has in the past, from surveying this group of books. Narratology, on the contrary, which after some decades in the doldrums seems to be experiencing a notable revival. There are really two outstanding works of narrative theory are Rick Altman's Theory of Narrative from Columbia and Monica Fluddernick's Introduction to Narratology from Rutledge. So Rick Altman is a very well-known film theorist at the University of Iowa, in a program that I hear is threatened by cuts, which is striking, a very venerable and very venerable and important film program. But Altman explicitly sets out to construct a new theory of narrative based not on plot, much less on the assumption that the norm for narrative is following an unbroken plot thread, but on what he calls following, as his conception. It's following. A narrative follows one character or group and then switches between one character and another, etc. So narratives are distinguished by their different following patterns, different kinds of modulation from one scene or unit to another. And he has a very simple typology of different sorts of modulations. It's a different good way of thinking about narrative, and they get very nicely illustrated by films. What kinds of shifts do you get in filmic narratives? His study of different following patterns yields a very elementary typology of there's dual focus narrative, There's single focus narratives and there are multiple focus narratives. So he's trying to work on craft a narratology that's based on narrative in general and not just on literary narrative, and uses many vivid cinematic narratives. And in fact, well-known movies are often the best examples for illustrating some narratological point. With literary narrative, he starts with the Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland, inappropriately named by that, so named by later scholars who seem to be presuming that the unity of action should characterize narrative, and so attempt to map what is blatantly a dual focus narrative. You shift back and forth between Roland and the Saracens, etc. But critics have called it the Song of Roland as if he were the center, even though he dies halfway through, right? And have to work hard to show that it's really all about Roland in some way. So Altman is very, very deft at showing the advantages of his very simple terminology. I mean, there's no heterodiegetic and homodiegetic narratives or things of that sort in it. His terminologically simple scheme and the advantages over much more complicated traditional narratological analysis, and offers, I think, what should be a starting point for further refinements. I think this is a book that will really become the basis for further thinking about narrative. The greatest flaw in this book is that he fails to engage Monika Fluddernick's groundbreaking work, earlier work, Towards a Natural Narratology from 1996. This is a book that was never properly assimilated because it's very old now, more than 10 years old, but Routledge published it as a hardback, and they were charging $100 for it back in 1996, which was a lot of money in those days. And they declined then to bring it into paperback. I and other people urged them to do that, but they said, no, it didn't sell. No wonder, because it cost $100. Nobody's. But she's trying again now with a shorter introduction to narratology, which is sort of a textbook to trying to advance her distinctive approach. But Fluddernick, hers was really the first narratological account to deal with the full sweep of the history of narrative in English. So she started with saints' lives and goes from saints' lives to postmodern fiction, trying to break the grip of sort of realistic 19th, 20th century narrative on narratological analysis. So Altman's approach is similar, except he's also got film in his, and also, but he doesn't use experimental and deviant 20th century fiction, as Fluddernick does that very skillfully, using weird effects in 20th century narratives that we are nonetheless able to comprehend, to try to produce narrative categories that would explain our ability to comprehend them. What sense of narrative and narrative structures must we have in order to make sense of this apparently incoherent sequence, for example? So Fluddernick also, like Altman, breaks with a plot-based narratology. So for her, something can be a narrative if someone experiences it. It's not quite the same as Altman's following, but it's moving in the same direction, and I really wish those two had encountered one another somehow. I asked Rick Altman why he didn't cite Fluddernick, and he claimed he had never heard of it, which seems to me weird, but bizarre. But anyway, Fluddernick, unlike Altman, tries to assimilate the best of recent cognitivist narratology. We didn't really have any cognitivist books in this batch, but there is a fair amount of work out there being done in the analysis of narrative within a cognitive framework, and it's still not clear, of course, whether that's going to prove a dead end or a really very productive mode of research. But and I can't really spend any more. I spent a bit too much time already on these two books. But these are two major contributions to narrative theory, I think, which ought to give a boost to the study of narratology. And indeed, the promise of work in this area is heightened by a third work, William Flesh's Comeuppance, which has nothing to do with narratology from his point of view, but it adopts a perspective of evolutionary biology. You've got the subtitle there, which is I didn't write down. It's something costly signaling. I've forgotten what it is. Costly signaling, comeuppance, costly signaling, altruistic punishment, and other biological components of fiction. Not a promising title, I think. But Flesh asks why we come to be interested in stories, and he offers a theory that they are central to the human propensity for community building and altruism. So he's particularly interested in how readers get interested in or get involved with characters. and it is complicated matter. We don't simply want the good characters to be rewarded and the bad characters to be punished. In fact, that would be sort of a simplistic reading, but we do, that would be a sort of simplistic and sentimental reading even. But we do, interestingly, we do tend to disapprove, we approve of other characters in novels whose judgments altruistically approve of the good and disapprove of the wicked. So, but I think this is a really very interesting engagement with the literary theoretical tradition, and Flesch manages a complicated feat of integrating sensitive, close readings of novelistic passages, not bits of novelistic plot anyway, and reader response into a consistent, which is to say, potentially reductive theoretical narrative. The book, at one level, the book is competing with Aristotle, asking, the fundamental question: why do we take pleasure in fictions? And the answer is not mimesis, not at all. But there is also a kind of winning modesty in the way in which his text makes room for a range of voices and perspectives, but especially that of evolutionary theory. And he marks very skepticism with in relation to Wilson and other evolutionary theorists. But he does stay focused on the question of how this interest in narrative can be accounted for by evolutionary theory. I'm not convinced by that dimension of the book. I remain very skeptical about the potential contribution of evolutionary biology to literary theory, should we say. After all, and it seems to me, at least at some elementary level, an argument about the evolutionary value of literature ultimately implies that groups that did not have literature should have died off so that they didn't reproduce. And I don't think we have any evidence of that. People, and even certainly not at the level of individuals, right? The people who have no interest in literature reproduce very well. And maybe there are cultures out there that died off for lack of literature, but I don't know. But Flesch produces many very interesting, shrewd and subtle analyses of stories, especially about the complexities of readers' moral judgments. So it's not enough for us to be aware of the innocence of a character who is being falsely accused. We want disinterested parties in the novel also to be aware of that, and it's a fact it's hard to explain without a complex theory, not just about our interest in fictions, but about our investment in social relations that encourage socially productive behavior and discourage socially destructive behavior. So, though coming from a completely different direction and employing a completely different literary canon and theoretical references, Flesch's argument seems to me to rejoin Derrida's account of the centrality of fiction to what we call the real in various works. But Derrida stresses the dependence of what we call the real on the structure of fictionality, exemplified in such literary events as mostly he's talking about Blanchot in these cases. And my own way of explaining that would be to say that what Benedict Anderson calls the imagined nature of every community, the social fabric, that is, the social fabric depends upon the as-if structure that's exemplified in fiction, whether we think of that as placing ourselves in situations of others and imagining our responses, or as our propensity to experience a sense of injustice or exhilaration at situations that don't affect us directly, and that's the structure of fictionality at work in our engagement with remote situations and scenes. So Flesch's work, in my view, contributes to illustrating the complex dependency of sociality on structures of fiction, whether or not we think evolutionary biology has anything to give there, and it does seem to be, there is at least a minor trend of literary critics trying to draw upon evolutionary biology. Lisa Sunshine's Why We Read Fiction is a sort of cognitivist evolutionary work, and Harvard just published Brian Boyd's big The Origin of Stories, which is kind of opportunistically trying to ride Darwin's coattails and much less successfully than Flesch, I think. Anyway, so there's a wide range of other works which, very interesting works, which examine a series of texts, often from different periods and languages, in focus on a theoretically defined topic. And I'm tempted to say that that's the major form that theory takes nowadays, by the evidence of this corpus anyway. Works like Flesch fit into that under this category as well, even though I treated it as narratology. That is to say, the major strand of theoretically major strand is not theoretically based readings of individual works or individual authors, not psychoanalytic, feminist, deconstructive, Marxist, etc., queer or new historicist interpretations of an author or a set of works, but work on a subject that is itself delimited by some kind of theoretical conception and to which readings of individual texts can contribute. I've listed about I listed about 9 of those, I think, on the handout. I obviously don't have time to talk about many of them. I could, many quite interesting ones. I'm running over here. I will mention, of course, Jonathan Elmer's On Lingering and Being Last, Race, Sovereignty, and in the New World, which approaches the hot topic of sovereignty in an original way, arguing that sovereignty is a racialized logic which shows its true colors, as it were, in the New World, and foregrounding the rhetorical operations of that logic. But I also want to I'll skip some of those others and turn to Barbara Johnson's wonderful and lucid Persons and Things. This is a posthumous work, a real tour de force, a very brilliant reflection on animation, on the porous boundaries between persons and things, and on the contradictory roles of materiality, rhetoric, and desire in these relations, in the relations between persons and things, and in the stakes of such pervasive rhetorical operations as personification, apostrophe, and prosopopoeia, all these animating rhetorical operations. This book contains one celebrated, previously published essay, Anthropomorphism in Lyric and Law, which reads a very difficult essay by Paul de Man about Baudelaire and a pair of Baudelaire sonnets and the conception of lyric. It sets that in relation to various court cases treating what counts as a person, from the Dred Scott case, which just found that slaves were not persons, to more recent attributions of the rights of persons to corporations, or she didn't live to see the latest from the Supreme Court, of course, or controversies about the personhood of fetuses. The question of what counts as a person and what doesn't is a really very interesting legal domain, of course. But the other chapters explore closely related issues, including the dynamics of how the dynamics of identification and personification are mediated by people's relations to things. Think toys are us, for example. That's a good example of that problem. This is the most unified of Barbara Johnson's works, 8 books, and it's a fitting memorial to her extraordinary talent. But let me just mention in concluding briefly two works that could be seen as contributing to eco-criticism. They're very different. Annelise Francois' Open Secrets, The Literature of Uncounted Experience, is a beautifully written book, very, I think, potentially transformative of the landscape of literary studies. And if I, to summarize it quite tendentiously, Enlightenment, reason, and especially literary criticism, an offspring of Enlightenment reason, are dedicated to the idea that everything should count, that literary criticism can be thought of as training in learning to make every detail count. So this is an orientation shared by very diverse schools of literary criticism. New criticism, deconstruction, new psychoanalysis, new historicism, all think that no detail is too small to count, and that's what close reading is, as it were, literary analysis is. To be no detail too small to be put to use in an interpretive scheme. But literature itself, of course, is full of moments that promote a different ethos, of an ethos, say, of letting be. In Madame de Lafayette's La Princesse de Clèves, for example, the princess avows to her husband her love for the Duc de Nemours, a love that she will not act upon. This leaves both her husband and the reader nothing to discover. It's an open secret that leaves her free from what we take to be normal pressures to act upon knowledge. The book stresses that nothing will happen, and readers need not try to make something of this. So, open secrets, this term, asked to be treated lightly. They disarm our exegetical impulses by declaring that there's nothing left to hunt for. So, Francois, looking at novels and lyrics that all voice perspectives antithetical to overt acting, she argues that these works function to summon up what she calls the uncountable or the unrecountable, experience that can be can be taken up or passed by. And she values the resistance of these texts to progress, rationalism, self-presentation, measurement, etc. So the notion of resistance is one of the ways, and the very notion of resistance is one of the ways that modern criticism has transformed the phenomena that she's looking at into something that counts. We say, this surface, unintelligible surface resists understanding, and that becomes a drama of, etc., meaningful. In any case, we are inclined to interpret absence or negation hyperbolically as resistance or something traumatic or sublime or the heroism of loss, for instance. So, in any case, in her introduction, Françoise cites, as an example of the open secret, the environmentalist activists' spiking of trees in old-growth forests, an act whose aim is to make nothing happen, to an act of which, once publicized, simply puts the trees off limits and preserves them from use. So that suggests a connection to Ursula Heiss's sense of place, sense of planet, the environmental imagination of the global, which is not written in the same style of gentle eloquence, but is very ambitious and substantial in its promotion of the aesthetic imagination of the planet, shall we say, working to explore relations between environmentalism, cosmopolitanism, globalization, risk theory, and the thinking of cultural difference in what she calls an eco-cosmopolitanism, to which the literary imagination contributes. She speaks to a broad comparative and interdisciplinary audience, but in a book it's not immediately recognizable as literary theory, though it enlists various literary works by authors such as Don DeLillo and Christa Wolf in its attempt to lay out possible relations between the local and the global and thinking of the future of the planet, as it were. So what can I conclude about comparative literature and the future of theory from all this? Flaubert famously opined that la bêtise consiste à vouloir conclure, which is certainly a good warning in this case. I can certainly say that this crop of books suggests that the ongoing strength, of the theoretical dimensions of comparative literary study in general. But I think I can venture to say something more, that in recent decades, comparative literature has been marked by two imperatives. The first is going cultural, which was already inaugurated by Henry Remak in moving beyond literature to all various other forms of culture. But then the second, that cultural movement by itself is manageable, but at the same time, comparative literature has been going global. It's no longer the Eurocentric discipline that it once was, though that vision of comparative literature of the European émigrés, as whether Auerbach or Rene Wellek or Henry Remak, has a lot to be said for it. That comparative literature studied a European culture whose writers and scholars knew other European languages and literatures, and where the cross-language influences played a major role in the history of literature. But that can't be the program for a comparative literature in our increasingly globalized world. But simultaneously, going global and going cultural, becoming a global cultural studies, as it were, is quite unmanageable. What in the humanities would not fall in the purview of such a comparative literature? So in this space, almost without boundaries, there's all the more need for theory, theoretical work to define particular topics that can be the objects of study, that can bring new categories for comparative study into view, and so continue to animate comparative literature for the future. Thank you very much. All right. So do we have questions, or is it? Sure. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Are there questions for Professor Culler?
I have a question. And small questions too. They reflect my own interest, but I was struck in your rehearsal of the early years of comparative literature. And I realized the reference was to Remak, that you pose structuralism, pose the period before that as having not been involved in theory. Yet people like Wellek or Auerbach were obviously theoretical in a deep sense, and I just would like to invite you to reflect on that first transition with which you were familiar from from an earlier phase of theory, which straightforwardly investigated, just as you said, what is literature, because comparative literature was faced with that problem. What is literature? How do we study it? To the subsequent versions, such as structuralism and post-structuralism.
Yeah, no, that's true. I was, if I had been speaking at Yale, and it would have had a different, you would have begun not with Henry Remak and his vision of comparative literature, but with Wellek, I suppose. Yes, you're right, obviously, that, I mean, comparative literature, I don't know, I guess it makes in some ways it makes well, maybe, you know, what is the story there? We do have certainly that cosmopolitan world of European emigres who were not necessarily theorists, but I mean, Henry was sort of rather anti-theory in my experience, though very friendly to some theorists, but anti-theory, and that was it was a different vision. Whereas Wellek, of course, was who ran comparative literature at Yale, did believe in not every theory, but certain that the study of various sorts of theory, especially about the nature of literariness, etc., and the structures of a literary work. And so, certainly at Yale, even from the beginning, the comparative literature was a domain of theory, which something that I guess I was sort of imagining happened more slowly elsewhere. I think Harvard under Harry Levin was not yet, comparative literature was not yet theory and not very theoretical. So it was an uneven history that really depends on where you situate yourself. And you can think of Auerbach as a theorist, or you can think of Auerbach as a literary historian who gives us with his amazing cosmopolitan knowledge of European languages, etc., an account of literature which others would then have to come along and theorize in some sense. But yeah, it's a very fair point. Yeah, I recognize.
Yes.
Early in your lecture, you talked about genre as something that you might wish to come forward, but as something that isn't reflected by the actual empirical evidence that you then looked at. But at the end, you talked about globalization as replacing the Eurocentric, and the Eurocentric had to do with traditions where there was influence, whereas the global has to do, seems to me, very often with non-traditions, that is to say, things that arise independently of one another without a traditional history. And I'm wondering whether that doesn't move us in the direction of genre, because that would be the way in which you organize things that come from different cultures, different traditions, that don't influence one another, but then each one of them, each time you have a new example, for instance, of an epic, you have to rethink what the genre of epic is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. As it happened, the group of books we were looking at, or we've received, genre certainly did not seem to play a major role in their theoretical enterprises. I do think that, the notion of genre is certainly useful at the level of globalization. On the other hand, it's also problematic because the template for a particular genre tends to come from the European tradition, and there's some interest. I've read some, I can't remember where now, interesting writing about about Chinese and Japanese literature and how important it is to try to fit it into the rubric novel so that it can get translated and get a certain play in the West, whereas if it doesn't count as a novel, it doesn't get translated or read. Certainly that's one of the problems that Natalie Melas's book from 2 years ago is grappling with. How do we do comparison if everything is in movement at once? The quotation from Bruce Robbins that which I ended my brief discussion of genre was I think rather too optimistic. Comparing notions of genre with some kind of objective measure for cross-cultural living standards, which has its problems, of course. Different cultures have different kind of needs, and so things are not the same from one culture to the next, but still it enables you to say that people in this country really are a lot poorer than people in that country, and they need more help, etc. So I think notions of genre can be useful globally, but they aren't a panacea and need to be used critically and kept in movement.
Topics that the books you mentioned seem to address, because they're interdisciplinary. And so I want to
certainly lots of interdisciplinarity. I don't know that I can do much more than say that yes, it's a certainly in the jury in our discussions we sort of are developing rules of thumb, like the books, since we have a lot of books that really do, in which literature and explicitly consideration of theoretical issues related to literature do figure centrally, we should make sure that we give the prize to something that does talk a bit about literature, since we've got God's plenty there. But so not a purely philosophical work of theory, which was something that would count as theory, but might be purely philosophical. The last time, of course, the Joey Slaughter's book is interdisciplinary literature and law is its main focus, but it's a very political book too. But the novels, and I didn't list the non-Western, the post-colonial novels that he reads, partly because I can't pronounce many of the names and would massacre the names of those authors. But it's a very wide-ranging post-colonial corpus that is put in contact with read in relation to the European tradition of the Bildungsroman. So it's a very literary book, despite its the title "Human Rights Inc." and the sort of globalization mode. Yeah, I think I'm afraid I really don't have a. The obvious conclusion would be that yes, literary studies is very interdisciplinary, and the books that certainly, but it's partly. Publishers are still publishing books that aren't particularly interdisciplinary, and they just didn't send them to us for this prize for the most part. Though Yale University Press sent us, Imagining Virginia, which is about Virginia Woolf, and they sent us a book by Eric Sundquist about Martin Luther King's speeches, things that were really not literary theory by any imagination. So they haven't recognized the interdisciplinariness of necessity for theory these days.
I have one quick question. It strikes me as odd that you're proving that there's a futurity to theory by pointing to an object that has no future, just a single author monograph. This is what we're told, would you give me a speculation where we're going to encounter theory in the future? Yeah,
that's an interesting question. I guess I'm skeptical about the claims about the end of the book, and publishers still are churning them out anyway, even though despite all of the complaints about how difficult it's become, they're still out there. So I don't know what's going to happen, and I'm not a fan of reading things online, or I don't have a Kindle yet. I don't know whether that's a better mode. But I guess my guess is that that the less the Twitter generation is going to be very different from their elders, that scholars in literary and cultural studies are still going to want to write things on their own, and that the monograph does have a future. Now, perhaps that will change very rapidly. Other things have changed very rapidly. But then we were predicting a paperless office, not very long ago, and that's my office has more paper in it than ever before, and I imagine yours does too. So I think many of our futuristic predictions are not going to come true. But yeah, it's true that we didn't get any dual author books this time, or collections. Last time we did have some, and not dual author, more edited collections, and we disqualified them on the grounds that we had lots of, the prize really should not go to a collection of essays by many hands, but to a monograph, even though that's not a rule. But one could imagine. I can imagine a configuration in which we really did go towards collaborative enterprises, but that's for your generation, not mine, I guess. Yes?
I was actually thinking a similar kind of question. I want to follow it up a little bit here, because I noticed on your list that more than half the titles on your list, you said the publishers are churning them out. More than half the titles on your list here come from three presses.
Those are the best theory presses, yeah. Fordham, Stanford, and Harvard, I think.
And in that sense, I mean, clearly, Fordham has become more interested in this when Helen arrived. But you've got a sense where you've got a few presses that have sort of cornered what market there is. I mean, the earlier question was presume that the monograph is dead, and maybe the monograph is surviving in various ways. But there is a lot of niche marketing going on, and it strikes me that there's something worth thinking about what is the location of theory within the way in which we institutionalize our practices. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I'm not sure what to do with that, but I'd like to hear you reflect on that.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I did think at one point when I was very aware of this strange sort of hybrid kind of talk that I ended up giving that sort of crossed between a list and a real idea about where things are going. But I sort of like the empirical. I mean, that's something new for me. An empirical basis here. I got all these books that we've been looking at. Well, perhaps it did occur to me at one point when I was doing this. Well, why did I just pick the? I didn't. They aren't all the. It's not that these are the ones all of the ones that I think are the best. It's partly that because I did give some to illustrate various categories. Like, I mean, I don't think that. I don't want to dump on any of the books that I did actually list there, but it did occur to me at one point that for this to make more sense, I should have given you the whole list of all whatever they were, whatever the 85 books total are, and then you could see more. But certainly, I guess it's probably true to say that. I mean, we thought of these seem more theoretical. There are plenty of books by other publishers. Let's put it that way. We thought these are the more theoretical and the more interesting theoretical ones, and I guess it's not surprising to me that a handful of presses would be the ones who are likely to be publishing the most interesting works of theory. But there's certainly things coming from other publishers that are recognizably in the same genre. Duke, we did get quite a number of books from Duke that I didn't really make it onto the list. I can't remember which ones are now from Duke that I did have on that list, but they seemed further from literary theory or more explicitly political and less literary or less theoretical and more political, etc. So Duke is certainly in there producing things that. That's probably the selection that I ended up making to try to talk about some trends was probably too partial, and I should have tried to give you the whole list and then talk about the trends and single out some from the whole list. That would have been better. But yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question about the strikingly a lot of these books. I mean, there are a few hardbacks, but a lot of them were published in paperback. The publishers clearly are expecting sales to individuals and not just libraries. Whether they are excessively optimistic in that, I don't know. But it's also striking that last time we did this, there were more medieval books. I gather medievalists really do still buy books, and it may be that publishers this time around are still have published medieval books that look sort of theoretical, but they thought that medieval belongs to history and therefore not to theory, and so didn't send them to us. I'm not sure. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
What about the anti-theory group? Has anti-theory grown?
I don't think I think anti-theory. The puzzle with anti-theory is that nobody ever seemed really very interested in reading it. The people who were already anti-theory certainly didn't want to read books about theory that were anti, right? And the people who did theory didn't pay much attention, so most of them sort of seem to vanish. And there was a big anthology a couple of years ago of what Theory's Empire. That's right. But again, I haven't heard much resonance or repercussion from the publication of that.
The empire's not growing.
The empire of anti-theory is not growing. I don't know. I mean, I do think. I mean, theory is more more diffuse and taken for granted. I don't know what it's like at Indiana. Certainly at Cornell, there was a time when theory was something special, controversial, that people could define themselves as, I don't do theory, and that would be, they might feel that they had to specialize in literature of earlier periods so as to be able to get away with not being a non-theory person. Nowadays, I don't think their graduate students would say that. I don't think they would say, I don't do theory, even if they don't really do it. They wouldn't feel that theory is not something you need to be pro or for or against, at least in Cornell, but it may just be that's because it's Cornell, and the people who come there are not going to be anti-theory these days. I don't know. So, yes.
Yes.
Going back to AI your understanding that literary theory is sort of in the domain in between domains, and that it is characterized by some sort of a movement of disposition, which to me sounds very much constructive. And if possible, you can connect this to your idea of Derrida's temporality, which I think is somewhat your understanding of Derrida's temporality, which is something because you argue that Derrida's temporality is marked by certain atranscendental character, and I think that I disagree with you.
You disagree with that as a characterization of Derrida? Oh, you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think his understanding or his presentation of the trace as such is very much rooted in a transcendental
Yeah. Well, that's not a really very good final question. I think it's a hard question and a complicated question. I guess I would say that though I don't disavow Eyal's account of my in my conception of literary theory, I guess I might have put it a different way and say that, I'm acutely aware of the complicated relation between, as someone who has been, a proponent of poetics for many years, I do think that there is a very important place for something like a theory of literature, not just theory that is sort of vaguely literary, but a theory of an attempt to do a discourse that would stand to literature as linguistics stands to language, or say a poetics, a theory like an account of literature, of literary modes, literary functioning, conventions, etc. Conditions of possibility of literature and literary experience. That I recognize, however, that that has not been the major strand of theory, especially since the days of structuralism, and that it's not likely to be in the future, that its work of that kind has come to have a place, a problematical place within the larger domain of what we call theory, which is often about conditions of possibility, but not necessarily about conditions of possibility of literary experience. And so with the strand of poetics that I've been championing within literary theory, I could almost take Foucault's line and say I am happy to be willing to be a happy positivist, and argue that yes, there are effects, and we ought to try to account for them. And I'm certainly sometimes inclined to interpret deconstruction and various aspects of the deconstructive enterprise within the broad orbit of structuralism, rather than seeing deconstruction as post and anti-structuralist. But so I think that may be some help. That's not the final question that you ask about Derrida, the concept of the trace, and an argument about Derrida's concept of time, which I think would have to wait for another occasion. But I do recommend Martin Hagelin's book to you. I think that you would find that interesting read. What? Sorry? Oh, Martin Hagelin. Do you have the handout with all those books? Yeah, there's one outside, but it's the Radical Atheism. Derrida and the Time of Life is the title, Martin Hagelin. That's the context in which I spoke about that.
Thank you for coming this afternoon. Let's thank you.